It was December 28th, 1997, and the match that was being called the match of the century was finally here. Hollywood Hulk Hogan vs. Sting for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. This wasn't a promotional tagline. It was actually true. Unsurprisingly, Starrcade 1997 was WCW's most successful event. It brought in over $20 million for the company, and 18 months in the making, starting when Hogan executed the most shocking turn to the dark side ever seen in his business. But that was just on the surface. In truth, the match was supposed to be the climax of a much larger and longer story that had been in the making since 1984. Supposed to be, but it was not. Magic climax, the road to Starrcade, right? Those are the questions we'll answer today. Let's begin. One of WCW's biggest contributions to its medium was in its use of metafictional storytelling. Metafiction is the narrative technique of blurring the lines between the work of fiction and the reality in which that work of fiction is created, often calling attention to the fact that the work is indeed fictitious. Doing metafiction successfully is a challenge, as you might have guessed if you've seen some of my other videos. How do you observe the Zelda rule and keep your reader immersed in the story if you're consciously drawing attention to its artificial nature? If you do this, you have a high risk of getting trash like Rings of Power. But WCW, with Eric Bischoff as the showrunner, pulled it off. And they pulled it off because there were ample real-life elements to incorporate in the story, which began in 1984. That was when Vince McMahon started a revolution in the world of pro wrestling. Before Vince, the wrestling business was a cartel that never had a chance of global recognition. It was an assortment of regional territories, and the sacred rule was that no territory would interfere with another. Vince destroyed this system. His vision was to turn his territory, the World Wrestling Federation based in the Northeast, into a national and then global brand. And in truth, it was the right vision for the industry. It never would have taken off into mainstream success if it stayed as it was. So Vince crushed the territories one by one. By 1990, the WWF was essentially the national wrestling brand. The business had changed more in those 6 years than it had since the start of its existence in the 19th century. His right-hand man in this revolution? Hulk Hogan, whose massive popularity enabled the WWF's success. One territory survived Vince's onslaught, Jim Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas, but it was hanging on by a thread. JCP bought out other promotions that hadn't fallen to the WWF, which enabled it to stay alive, but doing so took a toll on the company's finances, and it was likely only a matter of time before it fell as well. Fortunately for JCP, the media mogul Ted Turner decided to buy the company in 1988 and rename it World Championship Wrestling after a familiar television program that had aired in the South on his networks. Sting debuted in the business during this revolution, finding himself in the embryonic WCW by 1987, and unlike other major stars in the company in the 1990s, he was the only one who had never wrestled for Vince McMahon. So if you're WCW, you already had lightning in a bottle when you started this story. Because the story question was simple. Would WCW survive and defeat the NWO? Because the NWO was all about destroying WCW and creating its own promotion at its expense. And who better to lead the NWO in that quest than the man that had actually led the near total destruction of every other wrestling company? Hogan was the only major villain that could have made this story so big. And because Sting was the only major WCW star that hadn't assisted Vince McMahon in his attempt to monopolize the business, he was the only hero that could have given the most believable answer to the story question. So we see how the elements in the NWO story came together long before the faction appeared on TV. Bischoff got more recent inspiration from Japan, where New Japan Pro Wrestling and the Union of Wrestling Forces International created a co-promotional invasion angle that saw NJPW lose its top title to a UWFI wrestler. The cross-promotional beef paid off at an event called Battle Formation on April 29, 1996. There, 55,000 people spent a live gate of $5.7 million at the Tokyo Dome to see this angle paid off, so clearly there was a demand for this sort of stuff. Bischoff had both remote and recent building blocks to create this story, but none of it would have amounted to anything if the execution was poor. And, well, let's just say that it wasn't. But before we get into that, I just want to let you guys know that you can join my channel at the channel membership section or join my Patreon page, and you will get these videos early, see your name in these videos, and later you'll get some more VIP treatment. At Patreon there's some VIP content now. And here you all are on Patreon. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. And now let's begin with the NWO's first act. WCW acknowledged the meta elements in the story on the first day. On May 27, 1996, Scott Hall, who wrestled in the WWF as Razor Ramon, showed up looking sort of like Razor Ramon on WCW Monday Nitro. He came in like he owned the place, jumping the barricade, taking a mic, and interrupting a match, but he didn't attack the wrestlers, oh no. This was not one of those cliche invasion stories that have tried but never even come close to equaling this one. The wrestlers were instead evacuated from the ring as if this were a real security risk. Then Hall gave a speech. "Hey, yo, you people, you know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here. Where is Billionaire Ted? Where is the Nacho Man? That punk can't even get in the building. Me, I go wherever I want, whenever I want. And where, oh where is Scheme Gene? 'Cause I got a scoop for you. When that Ken doll lookalike, when that weatherman wannabe comes out here later tonight, I got a challenge for him, for Billionaire Ted, for the Nacho Man, and for anybody else in WCW. Hey, you want to go to war? You want a war? You're gonna get one." And if you can forgive my worst Scott Hall Razor Ramon impression in the world, that segment was a brilliant narrative technique beyond the shocking visual and the words Hall used that made you want to know what he meant, because this was the time when the WWF was doing its infamous Billionaire Ted's Wrasslin' War Room skits. These skits weren't doing much for the WWF aside from showing how petty and immature Vince McMahon really was and still is, but now WCW used those skits to further blur the line between fiction and reality by making it seem like the competition was actually staging a real invasion. Later that night, Hall showed up again, took over the announcer's booth, talked like he was still Razor Ramon, and demanded that Ted Turner get, quote, 3 of his very, very best, because we are taking over. Naturally, you're wondering, 3? There are more guys? And to put the cherry on top, Hall actually mocked Sting by name. The show ended there, with the announcers in disbelief. The first chapter in your story is always the most important. If you don't make your reader want to see what happens immediately, you failed. So let's just say that WCW passed that test flying on a rainbow. The next week, Kevin Nash, formerly Diesel, who held the WWF Championship for a year, demanded 3 WCW guys to fight him and Hall. Crucially, Nash insulted Hogan during this segment. And then over the following weeks, Hall and Nash, who called themselves the Outsiders, created chaos in WCW, with the story still making you believe that they were not contracted talent for the company. The line between fiction and reality was blurred to such an extent that the WWF filed a lawsuit about this. The legal threats forced WCW to have Hall and Nash deny on air that they were still working for the competition and to change some of their mannerisms. Remember, this was a time when the internet was still in its infancy. It was a lot harder to look past the curtain back then, so the story was much more believable than it would be now. The lawsuit took some of this believability away, but not much. This was unlike anything ever seen in American wrestling before. WCW accepted the Outsiders' challenge with Sting, Lex Luger, and Randy Savage in a 6-man tag team match at Bash at the Beach on July 7th. They came out by themselves, but insisted that the third man was in the building. In a show of solidarity, WCW's team all wore Sting's famous surfer face paint, and then when the Outsiders came alive, as it anticipated Hogan finally having enough with the Outsiders, and then he attacked Randy Savage. Hogan was the third man. The looks on the faces of the fans in attendance said everything, and really, if you haven't watched this before, you need to watch this segment to see those fans' faces, because this was legitimately unbelievable, and they showed this, the fans did. After the initial boos, the fans were so shocked that they almost fell into silence, but they still threw trash in the ring. Hulk Hogan justified his actions in one of the most memorable promos in the history of professional wrestling. "Mean Gene, the first thing you need to do is tell these people to shut up if you want to hear what I gotta say. The first thing you gotta realize, brother, is this right here is the future of wrestling. You can call this the New World Order of Wrestling. These two men right here came from a great big organization up north, and everybody was wondering who the third man was. Well, who knows more about that organization than me, brother? I made that organization a monster. I made people rich up there. I made the people that ran that organization rich up there, brother. And when it all came to pass, the name Hulk Hogan, the man Hulk Hogan, got bigger than the whole organization, brother. And then billionaire Ted, amigo, he wanted to talk turkey with Hulk Hogan. Well, billionaire Ted promised me movies, brother. Billionaire Ted promised me millions of dollars. And billionaire Ted promised me world caliber matches. And as far as billionaire Ted goes, Eric Bischoff, and the whole WCW goes, I'm bored, brother. That's why these two guys here, the so-called outsiders, these are the men I want as my friends. They're the new blood of professional wrestling, brother. And not only are we going to take the whole wrestling business with Hulk Hogan and the new blood, the monsters with me, we will destroy everything in our path, Mean Gene." In response to the trash in the ring, Hogan said, "All of this crap in the ring represents these fans out here. For 2 years, brother, for 2 years I held my head high. I did everything for the charities. I did everything for the kids. And the reception I got when I came out here, you fans can stick it, brother, because if it wasn't for Hulk Hogan, you people wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for Hulk Hogan, Bischoff would still be selling meat from a truck in Minneapolis. And if it wasn't for Hulk Hogan, all these Johnny-come-latelys that you see out here, wrestling wouldn't be here. I was selling out the world, brother, while they were pumping gas to put in their car to get to high school. So the way it is now, brother, with Hulk Hogan and the New World Organization of Wrestling, brother, me and the new blood by my side, what you gonna do when the New World Organization runs wild on you? What you gonna do?" I think I'm having way too much fun with these really bad impressions, but again, you had to be there to see how shocking this was, because for the first time in these fans' lives, they heard Hulk Hogan insulting them. They heard Hulk Hogan being arrogant, claiming he was bigger than the business. They heard Hulk Hogan declare war on the industry, saying he would lead a hostile takeover because he was too good for it otherwise, and he was too good for them too. The only thing good enough now was for him to take over the wrestling business himself, basically. From then, Hulk Hogan became Hollywood Hogan. The colorful clothes were gone in favor of black and white, which became the NWO's colors. He grew a villainous beard. Hogan had transformed from the superhero good guy character that he was in the 80s into a darker, more realistic character appropriate for the less innocent 90s. Hogan was evolving and intended to take the industry by force just as he had in the previous decade. And Sting? He was still in his colorful 80s style surfer character. It was already a mismatch. After Bash at the Beach, Hogan won WCW's title and spray painted the NWO letters on it. More NWO members slowly appeared in the following weeks as WCW was again set to go to battle, this time in a War Games match at Fall Brawl in September. 4 men were on each team. Team WCW would consist of Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Lex Luger, and Sting. The NWO, though, didn't name its 4th member. Then, on Nitro on September 9th, it looked as if Sting had joined the NWO and attacked Lex Luger. This was an imposter, but the imposter was so believable thanks to a voice recording of Sting that the NWO used that Lex Luger thought it was the real Sting, despite his insistence that he was innocent. The audience did too. The fact that this took place in the rain made it that much more epic. I'm sure it was uncomfortable for Lex Luger at the time, but it really helped. Sting's team members declared that they would take on the NWO alone at Fall Brawl. And lo and behold, the NWO entered the War Games match with, quote, Sting as their 4th man. So Team WCW was at a disadvantage. But the real Sting then arrived and took out the NWO by himself, angrily asking his teammates whether that was good enough for them and if they believed him now. But Sting didn't stay, and the numbers advantage turned the battle against WCW, and the fake Sting got the win for the NWO. The next night, September 15th, Sting gave a speech that I also have to quote in its entirety. I want a chance to explain something that happened last Monday night at Nitro. Last Monday night, I was on an airplane flying from LA to Atlanta. When I got to Atlanta, I tuned in the TV to Nitro, and I thought I was watching a rerun. It was a very convincing film. Often imitated, but never duplicated, though. And what else did I see? I saw people, I saw wrestlers, I saw commentators, and I saw best friends doubt the Stinger. That's right, doubted the Stinger. So I heard Lex Luger saying, I know where he lives, I know where he works out, I'm gonna go out and get him. So I said to myself, I'll just go into seclusion. I'll wait and see what happens on Saturday night. And I tuned in Saturday night, and what did I see? I saw more of the same, more doubt, which brings me to Fall Brawl. I knew I had to get to Fall Brawl and get face to face with the total package to let him know that it wasn't me. And what I got out of that was, no, Sting, I don't believe you, Sting. Well, all I got to say is, I have been mediator, I have been babysitter for Lex Luger. I've given him the benefit of the doubt about 1,000 times in the last 12 months. I've carried the WCW banner, and I have given my blood, my sweat, and my tears for WCW. So for all those fans out there and those wrestlers and people that never doubted the Stinger, I'll stand by you if you stand by me. But for all of the people, all of the commentators, all of the wrestlers, and all of the best friends who did doubt me, you can stick it. From now on, I consider myself a free agent. But that doesn't mean that you won't see the Stinger. From time to time, I'm gonna pop in when you least expect it. You could hear the anguish and anger in Sting's voice in this promo, which is why I didn't try to do a bad impression. You could see it on his face, too. Here was Sting, the one person who had never turned his back on WCW in his entire career, and now he was being doubted. And he turned his back to the camera for the promo to boot. Because you as a fan turned your back on Sting, now it was his turn to turn his back on you. These are the tiny attentions to detail that make a good story great, because each one makes the illusion it's supposed to cast on you that much stronger. In creative writing, there's often talk about a 3-act structure. In the first act, the story sets its world and the main character's place in it. This act concludes with a major incident that forces the main character out of that former complacency. Often it's a disaster of some kind. Sting's exile was that disaster. He wasn't good enough as he wasn't good enough for WCW, so why stay? He told the fans to stick it, just like Hogan. It was clear that WCW needed to change to beat the NWO, Sting most of all. Begin Act 2. But before we do, I just want to let you guys know that super chats are enabled, so if you want to support the channel in a small way and get a personalized, in-depth response from me, go ahead and hit that super chat button. I would obviously very highly appreciate it. Now, without further ado, let's go to Act 2, and we're calling it, What's Sting Gonna Do, Brother? In the following weeks, the NWO expanded its roster, captured titles, and caused chaos anywhere they went. The NWO was in control of WCW programming. Sting was nowhere to be seen, but the fake NWO Sting was still around. But then Sting reappeared on October 21st. But he didn't look like Sting. He wore a long black trench coat and black and white face paint, the NWO's colors. Was it another imposter? No, it was the real Sting, and he came out to the ring and attacked the fake Sting that still looked like his old self. But the NWO didn't do anything to help their comrade. The NWO instead came into the ring, and for those few minutes you dreaded that Sting had actually joined the group. Scott Hall argued that Sting had carried WCW for 9 years and had nothing to show for it, and because of what happened earlier, he was kind of right. And Sting was smirking during this as if he was acknowledging that Scott Hall was right. Sting didn't give an answer, he only said that the real Sting may or may not be in the NWO's price range, and that was the last time that Sting would speak for over a year. If his words were going to be used against him as before, it was better for him just not to talk. And this ambiguity in the second act was vital to the story's success. After the initial shock of Hogan's heel turn, the NWO could have fallen into that purgatory in storytelling called the sagging middle. The first act was over. The explosive moments of Hogan's heel turn and Sting's exile had now come and gone. So WCW needed to find ways to keep people watching to see what happened next. It prevented a sagging middle by staying true to Sting's word. By keeping Sting's intentions ambiguous, it kept people asking a simple question. What is he going to do? And it was working because WCW continued to stay well ahead of the WWF in the ratings even during what could have been the sagging middle. Before the NWO story started, Nitro and Raw traded wins in the ratings war. Now WCW pulled decisively ahead, often winning by around 1 million viewers a week. But I didn't need numbers to know that this was working. I was very young, but I still remember people in school in late 1996 and early 1997 not even really caring about the NWO as much as they wanted to know what Sting was going to be doing that night. Sure, there were chaotic moments and betrayals as alliances shifted, but that part of the story had already been well established. That stuff can only keep you around for so long, and pro wrestling today in particular is a medium that often forgets this. You need a fundamental anchor to your story. Sting's ambiguous status was that broader anchor that made all of this stuff feel important. Between October 1996 and March 9, after his final words, Sting soon appeared again, looking even more different. The week before, he looked like his old surfer self, just with black and white coloring. Not anymore. On October 28th, Sting appeared on Nitro looking like something out of a haunted house, completely covered with black and white face paint and almost expressionless. He was aloof. His attitude seemed to confirm that he was not part of WCW. In the following weeks, he attacked WCW wrestlers who questioned him, like Jeff, then turn his back on them and invite them to hit him. He wouldn't say anything, but he was testing their faith in him. Fortunately for WCW, no one retaliated against his provocations. This would prove important later on. Yet again, it was another layer to the story that made things more tense and believable. In December 1996, during a brawl between WCW and the NWO, Sting came out and actually stopped the fight just by his presence. He didn't attack any NWO members, but did attack WCW guys that tried to hit him first. Then he left. In January 1997, as the loyalty test continued, Sting aligned himself with the Macho Man, Randy Savage, who had also been exiled from WCW. For weeks, these two would show up unpredictably, but Savage would eventually join the NWO. Now, you as the viewer were wondering whether Savage's decision would influence Sting or came because of Sting. For a little bit, it looked like it did. Sting now accompanied the NWO to the ring. Hogan even gave him an NWO shirt. But Sting did nothing, and Hogan put it over his shoulder, confident that Sting had joined. After all, he had only fought WCW guys up until now. But everything changed at WCW Uncensored on March 16, 1997. With Dennis Rodman in attendance as a member of the NWO, Sting came down from the rafters and attacked Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, sending the arena into a frenzy. Just watch that segment and listen to those cheers, and you'll see how well built this tension had been and how relieved the audience was that Sting wasn't a member of the NWO after all. You could see why it was a very good thing that no WCW member attacked him during his loyalty tests all those months. He was now ready to pay it forward. Sting finished his declaration of war on the NWO by pointing his bat at Hogan, who looked terrified. And thus, you as the viewer were given your next reason for continuing with this story. You wanted to see Sting get to Hogan. Pro wrestling today has a recurrent problem in telling its stories because the bad guys are often cooler than the good guys, and this was typically the case with the NWO, which helped to begin the trend. If Sting stayed as the Surfer, there would have been a pretty good chance that the story would not have taken off with him as the main character because the NWO was just cooler. But WCW had a brilliant and simple solution. Make Sting cooler than the NWO. And they sure as hell did during the second act. So now you wanted to see the cooler guy win. And hey guys, before we begin the third act, I just want to let you know that you can buy this script with all the sources cited on my Ko-fi page, or you can just give a small tip there if you want to support the channel. I'd really appreciate it. The link is in the description. So now everything was about building to the climax. We were in the third act. And for WCW, there was only one appropriate venue for it. Starrcade was WCW's biggest event, but that was at the very end of the year, and it was still only March. So WCW had another problem on its hands. Sure, you wanted to see Sting take it to Hogan at that moment, but how do you keep people interested for 9 more months? Fortunately, this came during a time when the internet was slow and smartphones were a thing no one ever imagined, so attention spans were a lot higher than they are now, but that wasn't enough. WCW needed to keep the story hot. It did so by having Sting show up and attack the NWO at unpredictable times and in unpredictable ways. He never wrestled or talked, he just showed up and tormented the NWO with his surprise appearances and psychological tricks. He'd come down from the rafters, he'd come in through the crowd, he'd come in through the main entrance as the show was going off the air, he'd come up from under the ring as the show was on the air. And whenever he was there, Hogan would be terrified, assuming Hogan was even in the building. One time there was an army of fake Stings. The NWO freaked out so much attacking these fake Stings that they were taken by storm when the real Sting came to the ring wearing a fake Sting mask. It was a turning of the tables from what happened earlier, wasn't it? And to make the moment even better, he no-sold a punch and scared the crap out of Hogan, who was standing in the ring with him this time, and the entire NWO retreated. It was all so damn cool. You still didn't know what Sting would do every week, but there was one thing for sure about Sting. You couldn't wait to see him get his hands on Hogan. But just to add to the anticipation a little more, WCW officials played dumb on screen. Sting wouldn't wrestle, so they said they didn't know what he wanted. Over the course of 3 weeks, Commissioner J.J. Dillon, the on-screen authority figure, tried to get Sting to return to the ring, but he refused. Dillon demanded that Sting give an answer to what he wanted by Clash of the Champions on August 21st, and truthfully, WCW could have sold a pay-per-view just on letting fans know the answer to that question. Even though they knew in their minds, WCW kept it just ambiguous enough to tease fans that maybe Sting wanted something else. It was playing with its audience, making them want to stick around to see if their prediction was right. When Dillon asked what he wanted, Sting got a fan sign that made it clear. Sting versus Hogan. Ashes of a once great man has risen a curse, a wrong that must be righted. An evil has begun. Against an army of shadows comes a dark warrior, and a mission of justice. This is Sting. And yes, this entire thing is a blatant rip-off of The Crow. I know that. You didn't think I was going to say that? But it was so damn cool. And the subtext of that poem was clear. Hogan was the only man that fit that description. Soon, the match was made for Hogan versus Sting at Starrcade, the only appropriate place for it. The audience was right, and now that it was close enough, 4 months away, and you knew it was going to happen, you were so invested that you couldn't back out now. If you did, it would have been a sunk cost fallacy. The match was so big that the press conference for it was broadcast on national TV, partly as an attempt to attract more viewers for Hogan's new movie on the Turner Networks called Assault on Devil's Island. In the press conference, Hogan acted with bravado, claiming Sting was a coward for not signing the contract. Then Sting showed up late, and you could hear the fear in Hogan's voice when he ironically said Sting was scared. Then Sting slapped the table with his trusty bat and jolted Hogan, not even taking his eyes off him as he signed. Then he pointed the bat at him and left. So it was official. Sting, the man who WCW had always counted on but then exiled, would take on Hollywood Hogan, the mercenary from the competition, the man who believed he was bigger than the business. There was no way anyone was going to miss this match. WCW had simply made magic. Unsurprisingly, Starrcade 1997 was WCW's most financially successful event, with about 700,000 people buying the show on pay-per-view. With a price per buy of perhaps $30 each, which seems reasonable for the time, that would be $21 million in revenue, and it could well be above that. If you bought the event, tell me what you paid for it. There were also 17,500 people in attendance at the MCI Center in Washington, D.C. for a live gate of $543,000, but honestly, WCW should have done this in a much bigger venue because it would have easily sold out. They left money on the table for this show. It was massive. You can't describe it with any other word. Unfortunately, Starrcade didn't have a good start. Most of the matches were uninspiring, and Eric Bischoff of all people was on the card. But none of that mattered. People bought Starrcade to see one thing and one thing only. Sting kick Hogan's ass. If WCW did that, all would be well. And it looked ready to do just that. Sting's entrance was one for the ages. Amidst a show of blue laser lights tracing patterns of scorpions and Sting's menacing profile, the same poem from Clash of the Champions repeated in the same eerie voice. Then Sting came out. Just to heighten the tension a little more, Tony Schiavone ran the entire saga down for the viewers one last time. Quote, "We have to go back to the end of the summer of 1996 to remember the last time this man walked to the ring. And I say that because, as you wrestling fans know, it's not the same man. It is Sting, and what has lived in his heart has always been World Championship Wrestling. He was our major star. Hogan arrived in 1994 and changed the course of wrestling, and then of course Bash at the Beach 1 year ago when the NWO was formed, the world including announcers, promoters, fans turned their back on Sting. Sting has returned to the wrestling ring, here December 28th, 1997, to reclaim WCW's title from the NWO. What a perfect summary of everything from both the on-screen story and the much longer lasting meta story. Unfortunately, that entrance was the high point. The match was a disaster. I'm not here to get into the backstage politics. Sting was supposed to get the clean win at first. Then there was a lot of crap that resulted in a complicated plan for a fast count by a crooked referee, but the execution was a flop, so it left everyone confused as Hogan appeared to beat Sting fair and square, and then the match restarted, and then WCW violated the Zelda rule by having Bret Hart come in and call back to the Montreal Screwjob in the WWF a month before. If the NWO angle started because of metafictional storytelling done right, this was a reminder that everything you were watching was fake. Sting walked out of Starrcade as champion, but rather than a triumph, it felt like an anticlimax. WCW vacated the title and ordered a rematch after the controversy. Sting won, but it wasn't the same. The wind had gone out of the story's sails, and Sting lost a lot of his aura, if not all of it. Sting's reign after regaining the title lasted only 56 days, and Hogan was champion again by the end of April 1998. The NWO story continued, but it was now stale. The climax had passed. It was time to wrap it up after Starrcade 1997, but WCW didn't do it. The lack of a timely conclusion to the NWO story harmed WCW enormously. It would never have an event as successful as Starrcade 1997 again. And it would never reach those highs again because these problems came at a terrible time. Vince McMahon's WWF was learning from its rival and began its Attitude branding. It started to tell more realistic stories with morally ambiguous characters. Stone Cold Steve Austin had emerged as the WWF's leading man, and with him taking the front, it began to overtake WCW in the spring of 1998. Now, the conventional wisdom is that Austin was going to turn the tide that year no matter what and put WCW on the path to oblivion, but I'm not convinced that's true. WCW's major problem after Starrcade 1997 wasn't Austin. It was that it didn't have a guiding focus. It never found its next big story that would keep people interested. But the cruel irony is that it had one ready to go. All it needed to do was recognize it and pull the trigger. On September 22, 1997, Bill Goldberg made his debut on Nitro. He crushed his opponent. Nobody paid much attention in the midst of the NWO story, but it was part of a streak of 156 consecutive wins that WCW marketed as an undefeated streak of 173-0. He actually did lose one dark match, but fortunately no one was watching. Goldberg soon became hugely popular. He rivaled Austin. People wanted to see him go out there and destroy. By July, WCW was ready to pull the trigger. On Nitro on July 6th, WCW put Goldberg against Hulk Hogan, Hollywood Hogan rather, for the world title in front of 40,000 people in the Georgia Dome. The match could have headlined a pay-per-view, but WCW put it on free TV to beat the WWF, which it easily did with a 6.91 rating, the highest for wrestling on cable to that point. Now, imagine if Starrcade 1997 had been done right. Sting crushes Hogan for the title, maintains the aura around his character, and watches as Goldberg gets more and more popular with WCW fans. Both of them conquer the remnants of the NWO and encounter each other for the first time around May or June of 1998. But WCW fans are starting to gravitate toward Goldberg, and so the mercurial Sting is on a collision course with the undefeated Goldberg for the title, heading for Starrcade 1998. Can you imagine that? I can, because I can see myself as a kid going, oh no, I really want to see what's going on with Stone. I can see that. It was a dilemma that I wish I had, but it never happened. And it's a shame that it didn't. Would that have prevented the tide from turning? I can't answer that because it's a counterfactual, but I do know this. Although WCW wasn't beating the WWF in the ratings anymore, it stayed competitive, and 1998 was its most financially successful year with a $55 million profit. And people were also still used to watching Nitro over Raw in early 1998. It didn't start to lose until April. So if WCW had done a proper climax and conclusion to the NWO story and posed its next major story question, i.e. who would win between Sting and Goldberg, it might not have lost its lead that year. I won't say that WCW would still be around today. A lot would have needed to change backstage for that. But just maybe it wouldn't have become the massive money pit it was in 1999 and 2000. And maybe, just maybe, that would have convinced AOL Time Warner to keep it on the Turner networks. Unfortunately, history was as it was, and today we can only sigh and look at Starrcade 1997 and ask, what if? But do you agree with me? What do you think about the NWO story, and could WCW have not fallen behind in 1998 if it concluded properly? Don't forget to like this video and let me know in a comment, because each one helps this channel grow enormously. I will try to respond to each and every comment. And if you want to get these videos early and get your name featured in these videos, plus some other stuff, again, become a channel member or check out my Patreon. And here you all are. Thank you so much for supporting me. Next time, we're going to look at another controversial question. It's often the butt of jokes these days, but what if this shouldn't be surprising? What if Star Wars was always bad? That's the question. We're going to try to find the answer. Until then, keep writing and keep fighting. Thank you all for watching.